Hello, lovely witches. I'm really sorry for how bad the camera is. I'm not sure if it's lighting. I think it's also partly just the camera on my laptop, to be honest. Um, I haven't been on here for a while because we had the move. Obviously, that took up a lot of time. But then with COVID-19, everything got even more delayed. And I'm homeschooling my 5-year-old, which is really fun. But obviously it takes up a lot of time, and then kind of by the end of the day, I'm a bit fruitcaked. And we also had a bereavement, so that's been a bit weird to navigate through the new regulations and things. We didn't really get to, well, we didn't get to say goodbye. We didn't get to be a part of the funeral really, which was kind of tricky, obviously understandable, and a lot of people are going through a lot more right now, but yeah, it was just a bit weird to navigate. So I wanted to come on because I just wanted to come out and say that I really support Black Lives Matter. You know, I just feel that it's a really important message really to get out there. There are a couple of things I did want to mention which I felt were important, and some are witchy, but others are just more general. Firstly, I've kind of seen comments from some white Brits that this is just an American issue and not a British one. But I don't find that to be true at all. You know, police brutality towards the black community is an issue in both the USA and Britain. Racial oppression has been inflicted on the black community in Britain for a long time. And saying it's not a British issue and claiming that the British black community is jumping on the bandwagon is really just trying to silence people who are trying to speak out. And I think it's really unfair, and it is really a form of racism, because as a white person, we don't have a right to tell the black community how to deal with this. You know, this long history of oppression and being targeted for the colour of their skin and their race and their heritage. We just don't have a right to do that. So this is a time where you'll really need to step forward and support the black community to get their voices heard. We shouldn't be telling them how to respond. We should be listening and trying to help stop the injustice they face on a daily basis, an injustice that never should have happened in the first place. Another concerning thing I've seen is people complaining over a statue being pulled down or a statue being written on, when real human beings are dying. That's what's happened. You know, George Floyd was murdered, Breonna Taylor was murdered, and you know, yeah, a statue of Churchill had racist written on it, but that is what he was. He was racist, and sometimes people have to answer for what they are and what they were and what they did in life. You know, why should we keep lying to our children in Britain and probably in America as well, and validating the most terrible parts of our history and glorifying leaders that were not glorious? It's time to admit the terrible and the things that should never have happened, things that are still happening now. You know, how many more of the black community should have to suffer violence or die before we all sit up and listen? There should be no more. I also want to mention other ethnic communities here, because Churchill's racism wasn't only aimed at the black community, and there are other ethnic communities that are still being attacked and oppressed for their race as well, or their heritage. You know, Islamophobia is a huge issue in the UK right now, and although I'm focusing on racism against the black community in this video, I do want to talk about racism against other communities and just racism more generally in my videos. I've been trying to educate myself around it, and I've been looking into, you know, immigration in Britain, Windrush, but also the Syrian crisis, and basically how people, you know, countries including Britain, didn't step up and help the Syrians. and how we didn't really offer them shelter, and the conditions that immigrants are held in this country, in detention centres and so on, when they're applying for refugee status, are appalling. They're awful, and that's something that I do want to talk about going forward, but I also want to educate myself around, because I feel, I've got a lot more to learn about it. If you engage in ancestor work, which if you're following my channel, you may well do, it's important to remember that part of the healing work we do with our ancestors involves recognizing the bad things that they've done. And if we're white, then it's impossible to turn away from the racism of our ancestors, and to begin to bring healing and stop that cycle continuing. We really need to acknowledge it and begin making the changes ourselves. So I've said before, and I'll say again, how as witches who are white, we do need to be careful about not appropriating the spirits and deities of the Black community. There are very specific practices that tie into working with those spirits and deities, and I'm not saying that someone can't be called to a practice outside their own culture or heritage. I'm not saying that at all. But if you are called, then you really need to be willing to properly commit to that. And if we think about the history and some of the spirits and the deities of the Black community, they were involved in breaking their communities out of slavery and in keeping their spirits going throughout the terror that was inflicted on them by white people. So working with those deities and spirits isn't something to be taken lightly. You need to be, if you are interested in it at all, you need to really think about, would you commit to the rituals and initiation practices that are involved? Would you learn the language? Would you learn the songs? Are you truly going to commit to that practice, rather than just kind of misusing spirits and deities? And I think it's something that does still need looking at in the witchcraft community, because those deities and spirits are deeply important to many and a part of their heritage as well as their practice. And the ancestors of many white Westerners, they attempted to stop the worship of these spirits and deities. They abused people for continuing relationships with these spirits. They flogged people caught in the act of worshipping these deities. They tortured people and called them savages for their spiritual communities. And they used that idea of being a savage to kill and enslave and rape. And it must be really terrible and offensive for the Black community to see those same spirits and deities being misused by a white Westerner, used lightly and with no context to that history or the current worship of the deity, except for what they've read on a website by a white Westerner. Oh, this may be my little one. Hello, I just thought you were in pyjamas. I just thought I could join you. Right. Sorry about the interruption. My little one's currently jumping on a mattress that's up here. So as a white person, I think it's really important to acknowledge we'll make mistakes. We need to call ourselves out on white fragility. We need to recognise our white privilege. And we're likely to have misused terms in and outside of witchcraft. And I'm not saying that, I'm not kind of preaching at you. I'm saying that I need to do this too. I know that I've misused terms accidentally before, but the fact it was an accident doesn't excuse that. It's still offensive. And if we're called out on misusing a term or saying something that is offensive, then we need to change that. And one of the biggest problems that stretches across a huge number of Western witchcraft books is that terms are misused in them. So if we look at the use of Native American terms, for example, we see smudging misused. And I know I've wrongly misused that word. The fact that I didn't mean to offend anyone just isn't the point. It is still offensive, and I've had to correct that. And as a wider racism issue, language is very important to look at, and I might go into that more in detail in another video. So for the black community, police brutality is a very real thing, and we see it in America, but also in Britain. Orion, can you be careful, please, darling? For those who do not remember, we've seen the Brixton riots and the Broadwater Farm riots in the UK, amongst others, where they were really around the oppression and brutality of police towards the black community. We saw... Oh, thank you. Yes, that is mine.
I found it on the table.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is my name, thank you. My nickname.
Can you quietly, Ori? So yeah, we also saw Mark Duggan shot by police while unarmed, and the court genuinely found that the gun at the scene had not fired the shot that was claimed to be the reason that Mark Duggan was shot. The shot that was initially fired was a police-issued bullet before the fatal shot. They found that Duggan was unarmed in court, but still said that his death was lawful. And the media creates smear campaigns around the black community the moment any police brutality is committed. We saw this with Mark Duggan. Apologies for all the interruptions. The media creates smear campaigns around the black community the moment that any police brutality is committed. So we saw this with Mark Duggan, and the focus being put on him being a member of the Tottenham Mandem, which is a Tottenham gang. It no longer exists, really. It kind of broke off into separate groups. But the point is that, the focus on the gang membership in the media took everyone's eyes off the fact that police killed an unarmed man. And really, it stops people questioning the important thing, which isn't, is he part of a gang, or was he part of a gang? But, what were the police doing, and why did they shoot an unarmed man? It also fails to consider how and why teenagers are drawn into gangs. That's a totally different video, so I won't go into that. What I will say is that the UK do not use the death penalty, and the police are supposed to need a very, very good reason to shoot. And that, incident with Mark Duggan that took his life is one incident among many. So the smear campaign isn't limited to those killed by police. It also happens in other situations relating to both the black and other ethnic communities, as we saw with Grenfell in some respects, and my next video is going to be about Grenfell. We need to speak out about the racism the black community face, both within the witchcraft community and outside of it. Sometimes that's really hard, and I'm going to share this next part because I think there'll be other people struggling to speak out against particular people in their lives. I've had to recognise my discomfort should not come before speaking out in any situation, because it's not about me as one person, it's about the black community. And I had an issue with a couple of certain people close to me where I've struggled to call them out on their racist statements. And I know that that's partly to do with who they are in my life and my own fears around rejection. And in the end, I've kind of stepped away from them in many ways. I did speak against it, but not as much as I should have. And that's a huge failure on my part. That's hard for me to admit because I usually speak out loudly against racism. But with those particular people, I failed at speaking strongly enough. And I've had to give myself a bit of a slap and say it's unacceptable to whisper about it or stay silent in any situation. White silence is violence, and it is so important that we make our voices loud. And I think something that is really important in educating ourselves around racism is looking at white fragility alongside white privilege. We need to look at the history of the black community and understand. And certainly there's a toxic narrative in Britain taught from when children are young that's still present in many schools, where Britain's made to seem very victorious and claiming land and very heroic for stepping in and saving lives, or getting rid of dictators like Hitler. And it's just not true. You know, we need to completely break down that narrative. You know, what I was saying earlier about struggling to speak to certain people in my life, I think that we really have to compare that to the struggles of the Black community and think, actually, you know, it's our discomfort just really pales in comparison to that. And that's the important thing, because it isn't about us. You know, one thing that we do need to be doing, in my eyes, is looking at slavery and the whole truth about slavery and obviously other issues within the Black community's history. But I think slavery is very important because at school they don't often teach it, or they kind of brush over it, and children are not unable to deal with these concepts. You know, as parents, as teachers, we need to be teaching our children the truth. And I don't shy from discussing how slaves were treated. I don't pretend it wasn't torture. We talk, me and my son, about the reality of it, the iron muzzles and masks, the way the Bible was used to condone it, which obviously you can relate to the kind of religious right extremism, you know, that toxic use of text. And I think it's very important to discuss that with children. You know, I'm sure that there are texts within witchcraft that could be used to condone certain things as well. Certainly we've had issues around, you know, sexual predatory and girls being told that witchcraft as a practice must have some sexual element, and, you know, they must sleep with the leader of whatever witchcraft group they're trying to join. So we have seen similar things where, you know, religious texts or religious beliefs were used to back up wrong ideas, you know, horrific ideas. So we talk about that. We talk about, you know, the flogging, the starvation, the families being split, all of the horrible stuff. And there are levels of understanding. You know, different children are going to understand different concepts at different ages. But we need to break down the toxic narrative, the way that Britain's presented in Britain, and help children to understand the deep wrongs committed against the Black community in the past and now. As adults, we need to be educating ourselves around racial issues, and in Britain, the Windrush scandal is a perfect example of how the Black, particularly Caribbean community, are still being mistreated today. While we need to speak out, we also need to listen. We need to make sure we're supporting the Black community's voices and not speaking over them. So I'm going to end there. My next video will be about Grenfell, which relates to both the Black community and other communities, and is an issue very close to my heart. I'm going to post some links where you can donate towards Black Lives Matter in the little box below. So I encourage you to do that where possible. Much love, guys. Mwah.